They said the '70s belonged to blockbusters. Jaws chomped the coast, Star Wars blasted into hyperspace, and The Exorcist owned every headline. But here's the truth. Hollywood doesn't brag about, while audiences lined up for sharks and space battles. Some of the strangest, creepiest supernatural chillers got buried alive. Forgotten films with ideas so bold they still send shivers today. So tell me, are you ready to unearth the 13 ghostly gems blockbuster fever tried to erase? Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Imagine moving into a peaceful farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, only to discover the quiet countryside has sharper teeth than the city. That's the setup of Let's Scare Jessica to Death, a slow-burn ghost story that twists rural calm into a paranoid nightmare. Director John Hancock had barely $250,000 to work with, so he weaponized atmosphere. Mist rising off the lake, church bells echoing faintly in the distance, and Zora Lampert's fractured performance all combine into something you can't shake off. Lampert plays Jessica, fresh out of a mental institution and desperate for a normal life. But every creak of the house, every sideways glance from the townsfolk makes her and us question reality. Hancock even secretly messed with his cast, piping eerie sounds through hidden speakers, so the tension on screen came from genuine unease. The result? A film that barely made $1 million at the box office, crumbs compared to that year's hits, but has haunted cult fans ever since. What makes Jessica stand out is its fragility. It's less about jump scares and more about dread dripping into your veins like cold water. By the time Jessica's friends meet the enigmatic Emily, a woman who may or may not be centuries old, you're already tangled in uncertainty. Is Jessica slipping back into madness, or is something really lurking in that lake? Either way, this quiet film left fingerprints all over later horror, from The Blair Witch Project to indie chillers like Absentia. It whispered rather than screamed, and maybe that's why it got drowned out by the roar of the decade's blockbusters. The Other 1972, golden sunlight, kids running through fields, and twin boys who look like they stepped straight out of a postcard. But The Other isn't a nostalgic trip to small-town America. It's a slow, poisonous turn into pure dread. Directed by Robert Mulligan, who gave The World to Kill a Mockingbird, this was supposed to be a sensitive meditation on childhood. Instead, it became one of the decade's most unsettling supernatural dramas. The story follows Niles and Holland Perry, identical twins living on a Connecticut farm. At first, it's all innocent games and apple orchards, but gradually their games become sinister. The tension builds from the smallest details: a toy hidden in a barn, a fall into a well, whispers about family secrets, until it twists into something unbearable. Mulligan shot the film in sequence from spring to harvest so the young actors would naturally change alongside the story. He even fed them dummy script pages so their shock would look authentic on camera. Jerry Goldsmith's score, light and waltzy at first, turns darker with every passing scene until it's less lullaby and more funeral march. And that's really the genius of The Other. It takes the comfort of Americana, the white fences, the sunny afternoons, and lets shadows crawl across it until the whole thing feels rotten. Critics admired its literary quality, but audiences in 1972 wanted bigger thrills. The Godfather steamrolled the box office, leaving The Other to quietly fade. Yet decades later, its influence is undeniable. The creepy child trope that flooded horror films owes a heavy debt to Mulligan's twins. The Other is proof that you don't need blood or gore to unsettle, just the suggestion that innocence itself can be a mask for something much darker. The Possession of Joel Delaney, 1972. It's the early 70s. Manhattan is glittering up top and crumbling underneath. Into this landscape drops The Possession of Joel Delaney, a film that dared to ask what happens when the bright side of privilege collides with something it can't understand. Starring Shirley MacLaine in one of her boldest roles, it's less about spinning heads and pea soup and more about how terror can tear through family bonds. MacLaine plays Nora, a wealthy Upper East Side socialite whose brother Joel starts acting strangely. Strange quickly turns terrifying when it's revealed he's possessed by the spirit of a killer from Harlem. Director Waris Hussein shot possession sequences with handheld 16mm cameras spliced into the polished 35mm film stock, creating jarring shifts that made audiences squirm. The film's sound design is equally unnerving. Joel's guttural growls were created by reversing animal noises, a trick that decades later inspired younger horror directors. The film struck a nerve because it wasn't just about demons, it was about class tension. Nora is forced to step out of her bubble and face the violence and rage simmering in the city around her. It was controversial, bleak, and deeply unsettling, but it hit theaters opposite The Godfather. You can guess how that ended. The box office numbers wilted and the film slipped into obscurity. What's fascinating is how contemporary it feels now. Strip away the bell-bottoms and rotary phones, and it's a story about fear of the other and how privilege blinds people until the horror is literally in their living room. Critics now revisit it as one of the boldest American supernatural films of its era, even if audiences weren't ready for its jagged mirror back in '72. Messiah of Evil, 1973. If you want to know what a nightmare painted on celluloid looks like, cue up Messiah of Evil. Imagine a Lovecraftian fever. Dreams set not in misty New England, but on the sunburnt, neon-streaked coast of California. Written and directed by husband and wife team Willard Hoyk and Gloria Katz, this film oozes atmosphere in every frame. The plot follows Arletty, who arrives in a seaside town looking for her father, only to discover the locals are behaving off. Not your usual small-town quirks off, but blank-eyed, meat-craving cult member off. The supermarket scene, where fluorescent lights hum and cans of cat food sit like tombstones, is one of horror's most hauntingly strange sequences. The film's production design is equally surreal. Abandoned mansions become canvases for massive murals that seem to shift with every camera move. Cinematographer Stephen Katz drenches everything in sickly reds and cold blues, creating visuals that feel like they belong more to a nightmare than a waking world. The sound design is another weapon. Underwater chain slides, distorted recordings, and ambient noises that make you feel trapped in an echo chamber. And yet, despite all this brilliance, Messiah of Evil barely registered at the box office. Released in 1973, it was overshadowed by the likes of The Exorcist and other high-profile genre hits. Critics didn't know what to make of its dreamlike pacing, and it quietly slipped away. But over the years, it's become a cult legend. Filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro and critics of slow-burn horror point to it as an unsung influence. Watching it now, it feels like a missing bridge between '60s art cinema and the creeping dread of films like The Ring. It's proof that sometimes the strangest visions take decades to find their audience. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. Forget today's ghost hunting shows with night vision cameras and shaky EVPs. Back in 1973, The Legend of Hell House delivered a haunted house story so intense it practically dared you to believe. Adapted from Richard Matheson's novel and directed by John Hoof, it's the story of a team of investigators locked in the notorious Belasco mansion to prove or disprove the paranormal. What they got instead was one of the most claustrophobic ghost stories of the decade. Unlike other haunted house tales, this one layered science and the supernatural together. A physicist brings electromagnetic equipment to cleanse the house, while mediums attempt contact with the restless spirits. The clash of belief systems gives the film an edge, making it feel less like campfire storytelling and more like a grim experiment with human lives at stake. The visuals were equally daring. Huff used Panavision lenses to fill the screen with queasy greens and deep shadows, while sound engineers experimented with infrasound, sub-bass frequencies that rattled theater seats and unsettled audiences physically before the scares even began. The house itself, filmed at Wykehurst Place in the UK, looms like a predator. Corridors shrink around the characters, and every velvet-draped room feels like a trap. Critics were impressed, audiences showed up modestly, but the film quickly drowned under bigger studio horrors. Still, its influence is massive. Stephen King cited it as a major inspiration, and later works like Poltergeist and even Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House echo its style. What makes Hell House unforgettable is how seriously it treats the idea of the haunted house. It's not just rattling windows and slamming doors, it's the suffocating idea that a house itself can feed on the living. That's a concept blockbuster horror rarely handles with such precision. Death Dream. 1974. Picture this. The doorbell rings, and the soldier your family buried months ago walks back into your living room. Pale, silent, and wrong? That's Death Dream, also known as Dead of Night, directed by Bob Clark, the same man who later gave us A Christmas Story. But here, instead of holiday cheer, he delivered a slow, decaying nightmare about what war does to the young men it consumes. The story follows Andy Brooks, a Vietnam soldier killed in action who inexplicably returns home alive. At first, his family sees it as a miracle, but it doesn't take long before they notice he's cold, detached, and hiding a horrifying hunger. Tom Savini, then a rookie effects artist fresh back from Vietnam himself, created the corpse-like makeup that makes Andy's gradual deterioration so unsettling. He mixed crushed mothballs into pancake makeup to give Andy's skin that eerie bluish rot. Clark shot cemetery scenes guerrilla style, without permits, and the actor's genuine fear of getting arrested bleeds into the tension on screen. In one chilling moment, Andy feeds on blood to keep himself looking human, a metaphor so blunt it almost hurts. He's not just undead, he's the embodiment of PTSD, addiction, and the destruction war leaves behind. Audiences didn't flock to Death Dream in 1974. They were too busy with the likes of The Exorcist, but over time it's become a cult favorite, admired for its brutal honesty wrapped inside a horror shell. It dared to say that war doesn't just kill soldiers overseas, it brings something broken back home, and that broken thing doesn't always fit into the family dinner table anymore. That's a message blockbusters never dared to touch. Burnt Offerings, 1976. You think summer vacations are supposed to recharge you, right? Well, in Burnt Offerings, the vacation house recharges itself by draining the life out of its tenants. Directed by Dan Curtis, best known for Dark Shadows, this haunted house chiller is one of the decade's most underrated slow burns. The film stars Karen Black and Oliver Reed as a couple who move into a massive, decaying mansion with their son. At first, it seems like a dream. Spacious rooms, ornate furniture, and a rent so cheap it practically screams, "Don't ask questions." But gradually, the house starts fixing itself. Walls refresh, windows gleam, and the garden blooms, while the family inside begins to unravel. One of the film's most chilling elements is the chauffeur who appears in Reed's nightmares, played by Anthony James. His eerie, unblinking grin has haunted horror fans for decades. And the tension wasn't just on screen. Filming took place during a record California heatwave with temperatures hitting 110 degrees. Reed's sweat-soaked descent into madness wasn't just acting, it was nature doing half the work. The production also featured Bette Davis, then nearly 70, insisting on doing her own stunts, including climbing the estate's grand staircase without oxygen support. Director Dan Curtis hid oxygen tanks on set, just in case. At the box office, Burnt Offerings earned little more than a shrug, overshadowed by the fiery arrival of Carrie the same year. But horror scholars later identified it as a crucial bridge between Shirley Jackson-style haunted homes and the real estate horror of the Amityville Horror. Watching it now, the idea of a house feeding off its owners feels more terrifying than any poltergeist. After all, what's scarier than a place you call home that quietly decides you're just fuel for its next renovation? The Sentinel, 1977, Manhattan brownstone, great price, quiet neighborhood. Only catch? It's guarding a gateway to something you don't want moving in. That's the Sentinel, Michael Winner's bizarre and unnerving supernatural tale that made New York apartments look scarier than Amityville ever could. The plot centers on Allison Parker, a fashion model who moves into a gorgeous Brooklyn Heights brownstone, only to discover her neighbors aren't neighbors at all. They're something much worse. What starts as a quirky urban drama quickly slides into a hallucinatory nightmare where Allison is chosen to become the next Sentinel, the lone figure keeping unspeakable horrors locked away. Universal Pictures threw real money behind this one, about $3.5 million, and the cast is stacked. Ava Gardner, Burgess Meredith, Christopher Walken, and even a young Jeff Goldblum show up. But the film is remembered less for its Hollywood glamour and more for its grotesque finale, which controversially used real sideshow performers to embody its damned souls. Even decades later, it sparks debates in film ethics classes. Visually, the film is dazzling. Cinematographer Dick Cratina shot Allison's migraines through Vaseline-smeared glass to mimic distorted vision, while composer Gil Mele fused Gregorian-style chanting with Moog synthesizers, creating an audio assault unlike anything audiences had heard. Unfortunately, it released just as Star Wars was turning theaters into rocket pads. The Sentinel barely broke even, but it found a second life on the midnight circuit. Horror icons like Clive Barker later praised it, calling its descent into hell one of the most disturbing sequences of the era. In a decade defined by haunted houses and possessed kids, the Sentinel dared to reframe the city itself as a trap. The brownstone's charming facade, concealing eternal damnation, feels uncomfortably close to real-world anxieties about city living. You thought the rent was bad? Try eternal guardianship of hell's front door. The Manitou, 1978. A woman checks into a San Francisco hospital with a growth on her neck. Doctors prep for surgery, but what they're actually cutting into isn't a tumor, it's a fetus. Not a human one, but the reincarnated spirit of an ancient medicine man. If that sounds unhinged, you're right. The Manitou might be the most deliriously bonkers supernatural horror film of the 70s. Directed by William Girdler and starring Tony Curtis, this was Avco Embassy's biggest indie gamble at $3 million. The production leaned into practical effects. Prosthetics were kept in refrigerated sets so they wouldn't melt, and rubber bladders under Susan Strasberg's skin inflated with air pumps to mimic unnatural throbbing. By the time lasers are fired at ancient spirits in a hospital room that suddenly transforms into deep space, you either buckle in or check out. Critics mostly laughed, audiences didn't know what to make of it, and the film barely earned back its budget. But over time, the Manitou developed a reputation as one of horror's great so bad it's brilliant spectacles. The chaos of cultural clash, modern medicine versus ancient supernatural forces, was years ahead of its time, even if the execution tipped into camp. Composer Lalo Schifrin's eerie chant-meet synth score still pops up on horror playlists, and directors like Jordan Peele have cited the film's audacity as a creative influence. There's something admirable about a film that throws everything at the screen: body horror, mysticism, hospital corridors, cosmic finales, and dares you not to look away. In short, the Manitou isn't elegant horror, it's a wild ride. And sometimes horror doesn't need elegance. It just needs to blow your mind with ideas so bizarre they stick with you decades later. The Medusa Touch, 1978. Now let's switch gears. What if your darkest thoughts could literally destroy the world? That's the nightmare pulsing at the heart of The Medusa Touch, a UK production starring Richard Burton as John Morler, a misanthropic novelist cursed with destructive telekinetic powers. Directed by Jack Gold, the film had a hefty budget of about £5 million and wasted none of it. Special effects supervisor John Richardson built a massive 60-foot replica of St. Paul's Cathedral, only to blow it apart with over 200 pounds of explosives in one jaw-dropping scene. Bridges collapse, planes crash, skyscrapers tumble, all powered not by Hollywood spectacle, but by one bitter man's hatred. Burton was in full force here, rewriting his monologues nightly while sipping vodka disguised in a teacup. His gravelly delivery and volcanic intensity elevate what could have been pulp into something closer to Greek tragedy. The score by Michael J. Lewis added another layer of menace, recording distorted choirboy hums in a chapel at midnight for an effect that feels both angelic and corrupted. Despite its ambition, the Medusa Touch struggled in the U.S., where it was quickly overshadowed by Halloween and other horror juggernauts. In the UK, it fared better, but its legacy never quite matched its scale. What makes the Medusa Touch fascinating is its sheer scope. While most supernatural films confine themselves to haunted houses or isolated families, this one asked, what if one man's rage could topple civilizations? It's a question that feels frighteningly relevant even today. Burton's performance may be over the top, but that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. Phantasm, 1979. A teenage boy sneaks into a funeral home at night and discovers something he was never meant to see. That's the starting line for Phantasm, Don Coscarelli's cult masterpiece, and one of the strangest supernatural horrors ever to haunt a drive-in. Made for just $300,000 over 3 years of weekend shoots, Phantasm was stitched together with pure creativity. Coscarelli glued a camera to a skateboard to create the floating point of view of the iconic chrome spheres, then dragged it with fishing line and reversed the footage. The spheres themselves, deadly flying orbs that drill into victims' skulls, became instant horror icons. But effects alone aren't why this film still lingers. It's about grief. Protagonist Mike is a kid terrified of losing his older brother after their parents' death. The funeral home isn't just a creepy set piece, it's a metaphor for a kid staring straight at mortality. Angus Scrimm as the tall man embodies death itself, towering in lifts, booming "boy" with a voice that rattles in your ribcage. The mausoleum interiors? They weren't marble. They were plywood, painted white, and scavenged from a bank remodel. Cheap, yes, but chillingly effective. Audiences at test screenings screamed so loudly the distributor doubled the number of prints overnight. In the end, this little oddball grossed over $22 million worldwide. Critics dismissed its dreamlike logic, but that's exactly what made Phantasm unforgettable. Scenes flow with emotional rather than narrative sense, like a waking nightmare. Later films like A Nightmare on Elm Street and Insidious owe it a debt. Coscarelli wasn't just making a horror film, he captured the terrifying confusion of adolescence, when everything you thought was safe suddenly shifts into something hostile. Phantasm proves you don't need a studio budget to carve your nightmares into horror history. The Brood, 1979. David Cronenberg's The Brood doesn't just scare, it cuts right into the heart of family trauma and lets the wounds bleed. While other films of the era leaned on haunted houses or demonic curses, Cronenberg pulled his monsters from something scarier, real emotional pain. The story revolves around Frank, played by Art Hindle, who is fighting for custody of his daughter while his estranged wife Nola undergoes experimental therapy. The therapy, led by Oliver Reed's icy Dr. Raglan, encourages patients to externalize their rage physically. In Nola's case, that rage manifests as deformed children, hideous little creatures birthed directly from her body that carry out her violent impulses. Shot on a modest budget of $1.5 million, production was brutal. Filming in frigid Ontario meant the child actors inside the creature suits had to be stuffed with hot water bottles just to withstand the -20 nights. Samantha Egger's climactic birth scene, involving a grotesque external womb, reportedly had crew members retching as Cronenberg insisted the camera keep rolling. When it hit theaters in 1979, it made around $5 million worldwide, a success for its scale, but dwarfed by the cultural juggernaut of Alien. Critics were divided. Some called it exploitative, others hailed it as one of the most original horror visions ever put on screen. Martin Scorsese praised it as horror at its most emotionally raw. What makes The Brood endure is its honesty. Cronenberg wrote it during his own bitter divorce and custody battle, channeling his anguish directly into the story. That's why the violence feels personal and the monsters feel like literal extensions of broken love. No blockbuster could match that kind of psychological intensity. This wasn't popcorn horror, it was therapy with teeth. The Evil, 1973.8. Every decade has its overlooked gem, and for the 70s, it's The Evil. Released in 1978, this low-budget shocker slipped under the radar. But for those who found it on late-night TV or VHS, it became unforgettable. The story is simple on the surface. A psychiatrist and his wife buy an abandoned mansion with plans to turn it into a rehabilitation center. But the mansion sits on cursed land, and soon enough, an invisible force begins tormenting the group of volunteers helping with renovations. Doors slam shut, unseen hands grab throats, and finally, a literal gateway to hell cracks open in the basement. Director Gus Triconis had only $700,000 to play with, but he squeezed every ounce of terror out of it. Filmed in a decaying New Mexico mansion, the real-life rot of the house added authenticity you can practically smell. One standout moment sees a character dragged screaming through the floor by unseen forces, a scene that terrified audiences years before Poltergeist would do something similar. Andrew Prine and Joanne Pflug anchor the cast with grounded performances, keeping the story from tipping into camp despite the escalating supernatural chaos. And Richard Crenna, usually known for playing tough guys, delivers a surprisingly vulnerable turn as a man realizing science can't save him from the unseen. The Evil never stood a chance at the box office. It was released against bigger studio horrors and quickly disappeared. But horror fans who stumble across it today often call it one of the decade's most underappreciated haunted house films. It's scrappy, unpolished, and loaded with eerie set pieces that stick in your head long after the credits roll. Sometimes the scariest films aren't the blockbusters. They're the ones hiding in the shadows, waiting for you to dig them up. So there you have it, 13 supernatural nightmares from the 70s that blockbuster mania tried to bury. No sharks, no space battles, no lightsabers, just raw, weird, inventive horror that deserves a second look. Which of these forgotten classics will you track down first? Drop your pick in the comments, share this list with your horror crew, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep cuts from cinema's dark vault. Until next time, keep your screens lit and your nerves steady.